Hello, this is Julian with Coffee Reviews, and today we'll be reviewing the La Pradera Lot 7 wash process Colombia from Prodigal Coffee. And there's the bag right there. And Prodigal, based out of Boulder, Colorado. And this is their third ever appearance on this channel, having recently reviewed the San Gabriel SL28, a different wash processed Colombian coffee. And I did purchase both coffees at the same time, even though they do sound very similar. And that is because even though they sound similar, they both sound like my type of coffee. And it also felt like a great opportunity to compare them alongside each other. So it'll be interesting to see how this one turned out, as this right here is day 41. And recipe we went with for this coffee was once again Scott Rau's V60 recipe, which is a 16.5 to 1 water to coffee ratio, brewed at 97 degrees Celsius, about 207 degrees Fahrenheit, and liked this one best through the V60, which indicates a more medium fine grind. Roast profile for this coffee, also very similar to the previous coffee that we'd reviewed from Prodigal, which is to say that it definitely skews a little bit more on the light medium in terms of a more modern profile to it, which is to say, once again, not necessarily the lightest coffee out there, but still lighter than I would say the majority of American coffee roasters. So with all that out of the way, let's go ahead and start discussing this coffee. Day 15, first impression. And we did opt for the V60 once again, and it was offering an interesting bit of brightness as there was a more intense fruit profile that was reminiscent once again of that darker Colombian berry theme. And it's something that I discussed in our previous Prodigal review, especially with that coffee, as it did offer that sort of dark berry, Colombian berry aspect to it. Now this one was a little bit more present at the forefront on the first day within this coffee, coming out in a slightly more tart sense and a little more bitter than expected, as the listed grapefruit felt apt given that there was a little bit just more bitterness relative to the other coffee that we had had. In addition to that, there was a very slight fermenty stone fruit, lending itself to an interesting first impression. We move on to day 18 as we opted for the Chemex, and the cup was significantly improved from that first try, as it was still offering plenty of that dark berry, Colombian berry feel to it, with a little bit more of some nice sweet depth in terms of a candied sweetness to it. Plenty of citric qualities in a slightly bitter sense yet again, with a very pronounced caramel sweetness in the finish. A very nice second try, definitely improved from that first impression. We move on to day 21 as we opted for the April brewer, and it wasn't nearly as impressive as the previous days, as this time it's offering a little bit more of that berry-like attribute to it. Slightly less structure, less clarity, less definition, and overall just a little bit more bitterness, though it offered a very strong and deep brown candy sweetness in the finish. So there was a nice bit of a trade-off at the end of that coffee, but nowhere near the same standard as the first couple of days. We move on to day 24 as we opted for the V60 with Scott Rau's recipe, and the cup appears to be improving a bit with time as it continues to offer a mixed citric as well as tart fruit component, with the berry aspects also a little bit of intensity in the lingering caramel finish. So this was pretty solid, definitely saw a significant improvement. We move on to day 27 as we opted for the Chemex with Scott Rau's recipe, and the cup is not quite as good as the previous days, as there was an ever so slight grainy quality to the cup. The citrus continues to remain relatively well structured if there's a little bit more of some sweetness in the finish, and the entirety of the rest of the cup remained slightly more toned down relative to some of the earlier days, so it was still solid. We move on to day 30 as we opted for the V60 with Scott Rau's recipe again. And this time I would say that it's been pretty consistent among the V60 days that we've brewed with this coffee, as it's offering more of that dark berry feel, the citric qualities, and an abundance of caramel in the finish. Really nice structure yet again, a theme with these coffees that we've discussed up to this point. We move on to day 33 as we opted for the Chemex one more try, and it offered the same impression as the day 27 mark, as it skews a little bit too much in terms of that berry intensity for me, which was the main reason we did opt for the V60 as a preferred brew method with this coffee. Nice structure nonetheless, as there's more of the citric bitterness as the cup does cool down with the caramelized finish. Day 36, final notes we have through the V60 with the same recipe, and the cup continues to offer an abundance of consistency through the V60 with really nice structure, remaining well intact in terms of the berry and citric aspects with the caramelized finish. And I think that's really funny because the V60 days were extremely consistent, especially relative to the San Gabriel SL28. Both of those coffees seemed to offer just tremendous consistency with the V60 no matter what sort of adjustments we made. All right, so let's go ahead and put up the tasting wheel so you can see what we're getting. And we have quite a few level 4s, and right off the bat, you can see that this tasting wheel looks extremely similar to the San Gabriel SL28. So let's go through it. We'll start with the cleanliness level 4. And one of the first things that I did mention in this coffee was that there was a very slight fermenty stone fruit aspect to it, though that did dissipate from that first impression and that point going forward. So I wouldn't necessarily say that it hindered the clarity in any sense, but this one also had the same Colombian berry feel that the San Gabriel SL28 did, which I previously mentioned could kind of give it that sense that it's maybe not necessarily an overly clean coffee, but there wasn't anything to take away from it. No sort of smokiness, no sort of, we'll say, lack of structure, because once again, this coffee was very well structured. No fermentiness, no funkiness. So level 4, ideal place for it there. Finish, level 4. And just like with the other coffee, for whatever reason, it does seem to offer, again, that brown candy sweetness. And I still don't remember which one has caramel and which one has butterscotch, but whichever one did, I do have to say that they're pretty similar, at least in that regard. This one had maybe a little bit more of a bitter finish, where that one had maybe a little bit more of a tart finish. Nonetheless, I would say that it was still pretty even at that level 4 stage. Sweetness, level 4. And again, this one also offered, I would say, equal sweetness to the previous coffee that we had discussed from them, as those things at the top, all 4 of them are the exact same, mostly because at times I felt like, okay, there's only one really noticeable difference between these two coffees, and I do have to say that one's a little bit more tart and one's a little bit more bitter, both of which in that slightly more citric sense to it. So level 4, sweetness, I would say definitely fitting for this one. Acidity, level 4, and where that one had maybe a little bit more of a defined apple-like component in terms of the brightness, this one's a little bit more in terms of a citric direction. Nonetheless, once again, we're still kind of working with the same thing. It's still slightly tart, if maybe not necessarily as tart as the other one was. We move on to the berry fruit level 4, and that's the exact same berry quality that I had mentioned in that previous coffee. As I do have to say, I was tasting both these coffees, I said this as well as that brown candy finish are almost identical in both of these coffees. I can't really tell them apart. They're very, very similar, and if I didn't have that slight difference to kind of tell it apart, I feel like I would really struggle telling these two coffees apart, especially when brewed with the V60. Citrus, level 4, and this one's the biggest difference between these two coffees, as I kind of mentioned, it's a little bit more bitter, which is why the grapefruit makes a lot more sense to me, and I could kind of pick that out as the only really strong and noticeable difference between these two coffees. But outside of that, it's pretty similar, level 4 in that regard as well. Caramel, level 4, and I alluded to that brown candy, caramel, butterscotch, whatever they have listed on here. It actually tastes very similar to me. And they do offer that same just kind of long-lasting brown candy finish within this coffee. And I can see it as either or, truth be told. I can see caramel, I can see butterscotch for both these coffees. But nonetheless, it's a very similar sweet brown candy aspect in that finish. And then I think there's only one other thing, really, 2 other things worth discussing. Stone fruit level 3, that's also the same. So this one also has a peach note listed on there, and that's why both of these coffees really appealed to me, is for that peachiness, but I wasn't really able to get a strong peachy aspect from either of these 2 coffees. Once again, I could feel that maybe slightly when I was really thinking about it and looking for it, but I wouldn't say that it was an overly pronounced characteristic in this coffee either. And then the final thing worth discussing is body level 2. And obviously, making these tasting wheels side by side, I was able to say, okay, this one has a slight bit less body, though it's pretty close. It's pretty similar to the other one. One was at a, we'll say, true level 3. This one's maybe on the higher side of level 2. But other than that, I think the only big difference is the spice quality, which is toned down to a level 2, or that one was a level 3. But they're very similar tasting wheels, as I do think that this one was also a good representation of what I was getting from this coffee. All right, so my overall thoughts and impressions of this coffee. I think I like this one slightly more than the San Gabriel SL28, though, as you can tell based off the way I've described these coffees, they were very similar, and this one offered so many of the same characteristics. I wouldn't necessarily say the same level of consistency, mostly because the Chemex in the previous coffee was equally as good and pretty much the same as our V60 days. This one had much better V60 days than it did have Chemex days, so that was probably the main difference in terms of the consistency. Outside of that, structure, even the flavor profile was pretty similar. And outside of that, there wasn't too many differences I could take away from these 2 coffees. So this one, once again, I would say another good coffee, something that I'm not necessarily going to remember at the end of the year, but it was something that I would say probably exceeded my expectations based off of the impressions I'd had for their coffees in the past. But that being said, still was hoping for maybe more of that peachy quality as opposed to that berry-like component to it. Type of person I would suggest this coffee to, same as the previous coffee that I'd also suggested. If you're looking for something that is in a little bit more of that kind of modern, we'll say medium light sort of profile to it with a lot of those Colombian berry characteristics, then I feel like this one's a really good fit. It offers plenty of structure within it, especially in terms of that brown caddy aspect, the berry aspect yet again, and this one a little bit more of a citric quality, but kind of put those things together, and that's the best way I can suggest this one, and also the best way I can leave this review. If you by chance had an opportunity to try this coffee, I'd love to know your thoughts and impressions of it as well. If you're enjoying the content, give this video a like, subscribe if you're not already subscribed. This right here has been a review of the La Pradera Lot 7 Wash Processed Colombia from Prodigal Coffee. Thank you for watching.